Hey guys, tonight we drift into the velvet shadows of Versailles, where gilded chandeliers hang heavy over polished floors, and the scent of wax and roses mixes with a faint, almost imperceptible trace of paranoia. You trudge through the echoing halls, the tapestries whispering stories of power, privilege, and the small, ridiculous human foibles that somehow leave a stain on history. You probably won't survive this without feeling a twinge of disbelief at just how messy royalty could be. But that's precisely why you're here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander past the fountains of Versailles, listening to the soft plink of water on stone, imagining the daily routines of kings and queens whose lives seem almost cinematic, but whose scandals were no less dramatic. Louis XV strides through corridors like he owns not just the palace, but the very air you breathe. Yet, even in his opulence, whispers follow him like shadows. Historians still argue whether his indulgences were merely personal peccadillos or deliberate distractions from political failure. You notice the portraits lining the walls, every stern gaze, every powdered wig, every silk gown tells a story of status and often secret betrayal. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meats from the kitchens below, and you can almost hear the quiet sighs of servants who knew more than anyone should. Some say the royals' obsession with lavish appearances bordered on absurdity. Others argue it was a necessary performance to maintain absolute power. Imagine sneaking past a closed door and hearing a minister whisper about debts so large they could collapse kingdoms, or worse, about a noble's illicit affair that would, if revealed, cause the public to riot. Quirky side note: there are rumors that Marie Louis XV's queen, once demanded that her pet rabbits be dressed in miniature royal attire during court festivities. Yes, tiny silk coats for bunnies, because the French court loved the spectacle, even at the cost of credibility. As you glide further down the hall, the golden glow of candlelight flickers over elaborate parquet floors, reflecting in your eyes as if inviting you into a secret. Each door hides a story, a clandestine meeting, a whispered insult, a minor plot that historians still debate for its true significance. You pause at a window overlooking the meticulously sculpted gardens. The fountains hiss, and the scent of roses mixes with the faint tang of human intrigue. Even the birds, perched as though attending the court, seem to gossip in their chirps. Here everything sparkles, everything dazzles, but behind the glitter, scandal simmers, and the human foibles you're about to explore are both tragic and oddly comforting because they remind you that no matter how grand life seems, everyone has their secrets. Step lightly. You're entering a world where luxury masks desperation, where silk and gold are shields for ambition, and where the first scandal you'll hear tonight is only the beginning. Remember, history isn't always about wars and treaties. Sometimes it's about a careless whisper in a palace corridor that can topple reputations or even crowns. So you trudge on, ready to witness intrigues that make reality feel like a soap opera in brocade.
The shadow of Madame de Pompadour stretches long across Versailles, even decades after her powdered face and feathered gowns first captured the king.
Attention.
You wander into her world as if stepping through a veil, where every smile, every glance, every whispered compliment could shift the balance of power. Louis XV isn't just a king here. He's a man enchanted, distracted, and endlessly amused by a woman whose wit could slice through the stiffest court protocol. Historians still argue whether her influence over politics was a clever manipulation or a natural extension of the king's personality, but either way, she became indispensable, the shadow behind the throne. As you imagine her entering the hall, fans fluttering in her hands like wings, you notice the delicate way she tilts her head, calculating, charming, entirely aware of the web she's weaving. Courtiers shuffle and bow, some with genuine respect, others with barely concealed envy. She's rumored to have suggested ministers, approved military appointments, and even influenced France's foreign policy, but she does it with a smile, leaving everyone wondering if they are serving the king or her clever agenda. The fringe tidbit you can't ignore. Some gossip suggested she once orchestrated a small fire in the royal kitchens just to test the young servants. Loyalty, a test that apparently involved running through flames with a silver tray. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the story traveled fast. You step closer to a portrait of her in blue silk, pearls strung like whispers around her neck. Her eyes seem to follow you, calculating and amused. Think of the tension at court, where a wrong word about her could mean social exile, or worse, a cold, sharp glance that communicated judgment more efficiently than any official decree. You trudge along the marble floors imagining Louis XVI sneaking messages under doors, coded notes that only she could read, while rival nobles stew in their envy and speculation. Her influence wasn't just political, fashion, art, even the kitchen felt her touch. She championed Rococo aesthetics, turning Versailles into a living canvas, a theater where every gesture mattered. Courtier mimicked her styles, her hairdos became trendsetters, and even the king's private life revolved around her attention. Historians still debate whether her patronage of the arts was genuine passion or another form of power play, but the results were undeniable. You almost feel the silk of her gowns brushing against your arm, hear the faint clatter of a fan snapping open, and realize that in Madame de Pompadour, charm was as lethal as a sword. And here's a modern aside to make you grin in the quiet of your room. Some letters she sent to the king included tiny doodles, little sketches of animals, or funny faces. Because even a woman of immense influence appreciated a touch of whimsy. Imagine scandal and whimsy entwined, coexisting in the same space where decisions affecting millions were quietly debated. You trudge through corridors heavy with intrigue, aware that each step, each turn might reveal another layer of human folly, loyalty, lust, ambition, and a touch of theatrical mischief that would make any YouTube audience gasp. Or at least chuckle quietly. By the time you leave her world, you're not just seeing a mistress, you're seeing the engine of court life, the pulse that keeps scandal simmering beneath golden chandeliers. Hair Story is a reminder in the court of Louis XVI, influence was invisible, cunning, and utterly intoxicating. Every whispered rumor, every stolen glance, every strategically timed smile could shift history, or at least the mood of an entire palace.
The affair of the diamond necklace, if you think scandals can only happen in modern tabloids, think again. You find yourself wandering through Paris in the late 1780s, streets glistening with rain, gas lamps flickering, the faint smell of bread and horse manure in the air, imagining a story so convoluted that even the cleverest courtiers had trouble following it. Here, a scandal is not just a whisper in the corridors of Versailles. It's a wildfire that could sweep across the kingdom, leaving reputations smoldering and public opinion in ashes. Marie Antoinette's name, already the subject of whispers, becomes the perfect lightning rod. You probably won't survive reading the details without shaking your head at the sheer absurdity, but the French public loved drama, and this scandal gave them plenty. It starts with a necklace, not just any necklace, but a legendary diamond creation, valued at a fortune large enough to make your head spin almost 20,000 livres, studded with a dazzling array of stones that could blind you with their sparkle. The queen never asked for it, but her reputation was tied to luxury so tightly that the public assumed she owned or desired every glittering piece that passed through Parisian jewelers' hands. Enter Jeanne de la Motte, a clever woman with a gift for deception and a flair for theatrics. You can almost hear her laughter echoing through narrow Parisian streets as she hatches a scheme that historians still argue was either brilliantly audacious or recklessly foolish. Jeannie recruits an accomplice, Cardinal de Rohan, a man desperate to regain the queen's favor after years of estrangement and ridicule. He's easily manipulated, led to believe that he is helping restore his reputation, when in truth, he's becoming the pawn in a game of greed and deceit. The necklace, meanwhile, changes hands through shadowy exchanges, hidden in trunks, passed under doorways, and occasionally glimpsed in the moonlight. Imagine watching a diamond necklace being whisked through the city like a secret treasure, while ordinary citizens gossip in taverns, speculating on what the queen might have done, or, more likely, didn't do because reality and rumor are always slightly out of sync. The fringe side of the story is even stranger. Some accounts claim that a prostitute impersonated Marie Antoinette to meet Cardinal de Rohan in the dead of night, giving instructions to steal the necklace on her behalf. Yes, you heard that right, a royal doppelganger guiding a clumsy cardinal through a labyrinthine scam. Historians still debate whether this impersonation really happened or if it's this sort of dramatic flourish added by storytellers eager to spice up the monarchy's public image. Regardless, the plot unravels spectacularly when the stolen jewels disappear. Jean de la Motte is arrested, and Cardinal de Rohan is humiliated in court. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette does nothing wrong except be queen, and that, my friend, is enough to ignite the press and inflame public opinion. Pamphlets fly from printing presses, portraying the queen as a greedy, decadent temptress, her image carved in cruel cartoons and scrawled gossip. You trudge through this chaos as if wading through thick fog. The streets of Paris are alive with anger, whispers, and the occasional mocking laughter aimed at the monarchy. The diamond necklace affair isn't just theft. It's a perfect storm that feeds centuries of mistrust between royalty and citizenry. The psychological aspect fascinates as well. Cardinal de Rohan, desperate for favor, clings to hope that he is restoring order, only to find himself the laughingstock of Versailles. Jeannie, meanwhile, revels in manipulation, using deception like a painter uses brushstrokes, carefully orchestrating each move with flair. And the public, ever hungry for scandal, consumes every tidbit like the latest episode of a hit series. You might even imagine yourself as a bystander in a dim cafe, reading a pamphlet aloud and feeling the collective gasp of your fellow Parisians at each twist in this diamond studded plot. Even the courts themselves were theatrical stages. The trial of Jean de la Motte involved dramatic accusations, impassioned testimonies, and rumors that grew taller with each telling. Some fringe accounts suggest that secret codes were used in letters to coordinate the theft, or that royal servants were in on parts of the plan, but historians still argue whether these claims are truth, exaggeration, or pure fabrication. The point is, everything about this affair blurs the line between fact and fiction, giving you the sense that the French monarchy's world was less about rules and more about improvisation, drama, and relentless gossip. The aftermath is almost poetic. Marie Antoinette remains queen, yet her reputation suffers irreparably. The public, unable to discern fact from rumor, clings to the idea of a decadent, disconnected queen, a stereotype that would haunt her until her death. You, you can almost feel her isolation in the marble corridors of Versailles, a woman surrounded by power and wealth, but increasingly alienated from the very people she rules. Oddly enough, the affair also exposed weaknesses in the monarchy's administration and communication. If a simple scheme involving a cardinal, a mistress, and a necklace could spiral into public hysteria, what hope did France have against the deeper social unrest bubbling beneath the surface? And here's a quirky side note. During the public outrage, some artisans reportedly created miniature paper versions of the necklace, selling them on the streets as Marie Antoinette jewelry, a kind of 18th century viral merchandise, if you will. Citizens wore these mock necklaces, ironically, or to signal allegiance to anti monarchy sentiment, proving that scandal, like glitter, sticks everywhere it touches. You trudge past these street vendors in your mind, hearing the clatter of coins, the murmurs of discontent, the laughter of children who may not fully understand politics but sure know how to spread a rumor. By the time you leave the streets of Paris behind, the affair of the diamond necklace stands as a masterclass in misunderstanding, manipulation, and public relations gone wrong. A theft, a lie, and a rumor combine to create a story that historians still dissect, debate, and argue over. The monarchy may have survived the immediate chaos, but the damage to its image? Irreversible. You trudge onward, the flicker of gas lamps casting long shadows, remembering that sometimes The smallest object, a necklace, a note, a whisper can topple reputations more efficiently than an army ever could. And with that, you're ready to move deeper into the tangled personal lives behind the gilded curtains, where hidden marriages and secret children await to complicate everything you thought you knew about royal life. You slip quietly past the royal gates and into the quieter corridors of Versailles, where not every door opens onto a gilded ballroom or a chandelier lit salon. Some doors hide secrets so delicate and controversial that even a misstep in stepping across their threshold could send shockwaves through generations. Hidden marriages and secret children have always been a favorite topic of scandal, not just because they defy social and political norms, but because they transform family lines, succession debates, and the very understanding of who truly belongs in power. Imagine for a moment tripping over an old, dusty document that lists the names of children no one dared acknowledge, or peering through a keyhole and witnessing whispered vows in candlelight. The air smells faintly of old parchment and polished wood, a mixture that seems to hold centuries of intrigue. Louis XV himself wasn't entirely immune to these murmurs. Though married to Marie Antoinette, whispers circulated of extramarital liaisons, quiet unions with ladies in waiting, and children quietly provided for in the shadows of the palace. Historians still argue whether these children were officially recognized, discreetly cared for, or simply rumors cultivated to tarnish the king's public image. You probably won't survive the notion without smirking at the sheer human folly involved. Men in powdered wigs and silk coats, plotting political maneuvers while sneaking around to avoid detection of family affairs. And, as is often the case in Versailles, the line between rumor and reality is deliberately blurred, making you wonder if any truth can ever be safely extracted. The fringe side of these secret unions is delightfully absurd. Some accounts suggest that courtiers would hide children in trunks, or nannies would smuggle them through side passages during state visits. Imagine tiny feet padding silently across marble floors, servants holding their breath as the future of royal lineage tiptoes unnoticed past the king's study. There's even the tale of a child raised almost entirely in the palace garden, taught to recite prayers and etiquette while playing among fountains and statues, completely shielded from the scandalous eyes of visiting dignitaries. You step down a shadowed hallway and picture the nervous energy of the courtiers. Those aware of the secret unions must balance loyalty, discretion, and fear. One slip of the tongue, one misplaced letter could undo careers or spark public scandal. And strangely, some of the very same courtiers who profited from gossip were also complicit in these arrangements, mediating exchanges of funds or tokens of support for unacknowledged children. This delicate dance creates a tension that's almost palpable in the air, as though the walls themselves lean in to listen and judge. The implications for succession are just as fascinating. Imagine a royal child, born quietly in a side chamber, whose existence could challenge a public heir or alter political alliances. Historians still argue whether some succession crises were actually fueled by the presence of such hidden children, or whether the rumors were deliberately propagated to manipulate power structures. Even if these unions were legitimate, their secrecy ensured that social hierarchies were maintained while private dramas raged unchecked. And yet, there's a touch of human comedy here. Some parents went to extreme lengths to disguise their offspring's origin, sending them to distant provinces under false identities, tutoring them in secret languages, or arranging for them to receive miniature versions of courtly ceremonies in hidden chambers. You can almost see a young child, dressed in a tiny powdered wig, bowing to an empty chair in a forgotten wing of the palace, wondering why the world outside seems so confusing. Through all this, you feel the tension between public performance and private desire. Royals were expected to embody virtue and duty, yet human nature, curiosity, and desire never respect protocol. You trudge along corridors where the scent of wax candles mixes with roses and intrigue, aware that behind every closed door another clandestine ceremony could be taking place. Every whispered secret, every quiet marriage, every hidden child contributes to a web of complexity that is as fascinating as it is scandalous. By the time you pause at a window overlooking the vast gardens, you notice the symmetry and order imposed by human hands, but also the secrets that disrupt that order, invisible yet powerful. Hidden marriages and secret children remind you that even in a world ruled by protocol and wealth, human impulses are messy, unpredictable, and often poetic. You step away, feeling the tug of curiosity. What would it have been like to live in a palace where lineage itself could be questioned, where each whispered rumor could hold the weight of kingdoms, and where secrecy was both protection and peril? The royal debt crisis creeps into your imagination like the first chill of evening, subtle yet impossible to ignore. You trudge along the polished corridors of Versailles, aware of the enormous wealth displayed in every gilded frame, every silk drape, every golden candelabrum. But behind that glittering facade lies a story of financial recklessness that historians still argue shaped the fate of a nation. Louis XV and later Louis XVI presided over an economy teetering on the brink, fueled by extravagant spending, mysterious loans, and a court addicted to spectacle. You probably won't survive the thought without wincing at the sums. Tens of millions of livres funneled into palaces, gardens, horses, and yes, lavish parties where dancers' costumes cost more than a soldier's annual pay. The debt isn't just numbers in a ledger, it's a living, breathing scandal. Ministers scramble to cover deficits, financiers whisper urgent calculations in shadowed halls, and every new purchase of silk or porcelain seems to taunt a kingdom already gasping under the weight of its own consumption. Fringe stories suggest that certain courtiers maintained private personal treasuries in hidden compartments of the palace, storing gold coins in false panels or beneath floorboards. Historians still debate whether these clandestine stashes were a clever hedge against royal mismanagement or simply the eccentricities of wealthy aristocrats. Either way, it paints a vivid picture. The more Versailles sparkles, the deeper the financial rot beneath. You step into the gardens, the fountains spraying a fine mist over meticulously manicured hedges. Here, amidst the aesthetic perfection, the money story becomes human. You can imagine a gardener counting coins left in a tip jar by a visiting noble, knowing that the treasury itself is nearly bankrupt. Think of the bakers, tailors, and masons paid irregularly, struggling to survive while the royal family lives in excess. Every chandelier above your head seems heavier with the weight of debt, every gilded mirror reflecting not just opulence, but the precariousness of a kingdom on the edge. The queen herself, Marie Antoinette, becomes an unwitting symbol of this crisis. Fashion, leisure, and private indulgence were interpreted by the public as evidence of fiscal irresponsibility, whether fair or not. Rumors claimed that she spent astronomical sums on gowns and jewelry, while ordinary citizens starved the claim historians still argue about in terms of its actual truth versus political propaganda. You trudge past these stories, like walking through fog, unsure where fact ends and rumor begins, yet aware that perception was enough to stoke anger and resentment. Banks, financiers, and even foreign powers were drawn into the scandal. Secret loans flowed into royal coffers, often shrouded in complex agreements and hidden signatures. Some fringe accounts suggest that members of the court engaged in covert trading of bonds, gambling on the monarchy's creditworthiness like it was a stock market game centuries ahead of its time. Imagine Louis XVI reading letters filled with promises of repayment, scribbled in spidery handwriting, knowing that each signature binds the nation's future to uncertainty. Historians still debate whether some of these financial maneuvers were deliberate attempts to maintain illusion or simply desperate, uncoordinated measures to keep Versailles shining. And there's a human angle in the chaos that's almost cinematic. Servants and courtiers would sometimes speculate about who might next be in debt, to whom whispering about loans, unpaid bills, and favoritism. You can picture an accountant hiding behind a folding screen, counting coins in a silver tray, while imagining the king's extravagant lifestyle just a few floors above. Quirky anecdote. Some nobles reportedly staged mock auctions of imaginary assets in salons as a way to make light of the growing fiscal crisis, turning anxiety into absurd theater, much to the amusement of their peers. By the time you leave the palace halls and step onto the cobblestone streets of Paris, the royal debt crisis is more than numbers, it's scandal embodied. Public resentment simmers beneath every cobblestone, every bakery, every market square. A society that sees its rulers lavishly display wealth while ordinary citizens scrape by is ripe for whispers, gossip, and eventually revolution. The glittering chandeliers of Versailles now look fragile, almost precarious, like fragile ice over a deep, cold river. As you walk back toward the palace gates, remember every coin spent, every extravagant party, every mysterious loan contributes to a story that historians still argue about, but which ordinary people experience as daily outrage. Debt isn't just accounting, it's social tension, human folly, and the perfect setup for the scandals and, eventually, the upheavals you'll see unfold in the coming years. And with that, you're ready to glimpse the darker corners of courtly life, where poisonings, strange deaths, and secret plots lurk behind the golden facade, waiting to shock, amuse, and unsettle in equal measure. The corridors grow quieter now, though the tension thickens. You trudge past mirrors that reflect not only your image, but the centuries of whispered threats and secret glances that filled these halls. Courtly poisonings and strange deaths are not mere rumors, they're the shadows of Versailles, lingering behind every chandelier and tapestry. You probably won't survive this without feeling a shiver at the thought that a small vial, a poisoned cup, or a subtly laced letter could topple a life, a reputation, or even a dynasty. Historians still argue whether some of the alleged poisonings were real or the inventions of a paranoid public hungry for drama, but either way, the fear they inspired shaped behavior and gossip for decades. You imagine a servant slipping through a dim hallway, a silver tray shaking ever so slightly as it carries wine to an unsuspecting guest. The scent of roses mixes with candle wax, and an undercurrent of something sharper, more sinister. Fringe rumors suggest that some nobles practice slow acting poisons as a form of subtle competition. Think of it as early corporate sabotage, but with a deadly twist. It's whispered that one particularly eccentric duchess carried small pouches of powdered belladonna in her ornate reticule, using them to test the loyalty of her attendants. The courts are rife with these small, terrifying tests of obedience, and you trudge carefully in your imagination, noting how paranoia seeps into every aspect of life. Strange deaths, too, add layers to the intrigue. A nobleman collapses at a dinner table, natural causes, some say, foul play, others insist. Historians still debate whether accidental poisonings in kitchens, mysterious illnesses, or misdiagnosed maladies contributed more to the court's aura of danger than deliberate plots. And then there's the theatrical aspect. Funerals that became public spectacles, whispers about family members who might have had motives, and the odd, almost darkly comical story of a small dog allegedly poisoned after chewing on a missive meant for a human victim. You can almost hear the echo of laughter, nervous and restrained, as courtiers trade these tales behind fans and gilded screens. You trudge deeper into the palace wings, where medical texts and perfumed vials crowd shelves. Physicians of the day are part scientists, part fortune tellers, offering diagnoses with one hand while hiding suspicions with the other. Some claim that specific herbs could ward off poison crocodile dung was occasionally used in sunscreen. Remember, though effectiveness is dubious at best. The line between fact and superstition blurs, and historians still argue how much of the court's fear was rational versus performative. The sensation of suspense is almost tactile, as if the air itself carries the weight of unspoken threats. Court politics amplify the tension. A small betrayal can spark a cascade of accusations. You imagine a jealous noble arranging a subtle misstep, an ill-timed gift, a poisoned note left on the wrong desk. Each act, whether intended to harm or simply intimidate, contributes to a climate where trust is scarce and rumor carries more weight than proof. Fringe stories even suggest that some servants were rewarded for spying on their employers' meals, reporting any unusual behavior that might indicate poisoning. You trudge through these possibilities, aware that every shadow could be hiding both danger and intrigue, that every polite smile might conceal deadly intent. The psychological toll is profound. The fear of being poisoned seeps into dining customs, conversation, and social interactions. Even when no harm occurs, the mere possibility shapes etiquette, power dynamics, and the intensity of courtly gossip. Some courtiers became so obsessed with personal safety that they developed rituals to test food and drink, using animals, utensils, or proxy tasters. Historians still debate whether these precautions were extreme paranoia or clever risk management, but you can feel the anxiety pressing in through the palace walls. Amid all this, life continues. Balls are held, dances performed, gossip exchanged, and yet beneath the glitter and music lies an invisible current of tension. The courtly poisonings and strange deaths serve as a reminder. In Versailles, even a small act, an unattended cup, a forgotten vial could ripple through the hierarchy, damaging reputations or shaping policy. Quirky aside, one noble supposedly carried a miniature skeleton in his pocket, claiming it would ward off evil spirits and poisoned enemies. Whether superstition, showmanship, or genuine fear, it's a vivid example of how imagination and reality intertwined. By the time you step back from these shadowed corridors, you've traversed a world where danger is invisible yet omnipresent. The gilded walls of Versailles conceal both opulence and menace, laughter and threat, ambition and paranoia. You trudge onward, ready to witness the next layer of scandal, Marie Antoinette's fashion choices, which may seem superficial but carry deep political and social consequences. In a world where a dress can incite fury, where powdered wigs signal loyalty and power, and where rumor can travel faster than a carriage, even clothing becomes a stage for intrigue. The candles are still flickering, the marble floors still polished to a mirror's gleam, but as you trudge further into Versailles, the court's venomous whispers take a new shape, less about poisons, more about silks, ribbons, and shoes. And here, history becomes almost absurd. Fashion, that fluttering, frilly, outwardly trivial thing, emerges as both a battlefield and a weapon. At the center of it all, of course, stands Marie Antoinette, queen of excess in the popular imagination, forever remembered for gowns so wide they could block a doorway and hairstyles so tall they defied gravity itself. You can almost hear the swish of her skirts, the rustle of embroidered taffeta, the faint creak of whalebone corsets as the queen and her ladies parade through the hall of mirrors. But fashion here is not mere vanity. It is politics, propaganda, and performance, stitched together with silk threads and paid for by taxes pulled from peasants who can barely afford bread. Each outfit is a proclamation, a declaration of status, a statement to allies and enemies alike. Let's start with the famous robe à la française, those gowns with stiff bodices and cascading pleats that swept the ground like waves of fabric. They were heavy, costly, and suffocating in summer, but they made the body a pedestal for wealth. Marie Antoinette embraced these fashions with gusto, yet she also toyed with scandal by discarding them. In 1783, she sat for a portrait wearing a simple muslin gown called the chemise à la reine, a white, airy dress that looked more like an undergarment than royal attire. The public response was immediate and furious. Critics accused her of indecency, of disrespecting French silk weavers, of undermining the dignity of the monarchy itself. A gown became a political act, a storm in lace and cotton. You trudge mentally through the wardrobe, powdered wigs towering with feathers, model ships, even gardens perched on top, shoes embroidered with gold thread and pearls, cosmetics so thick they could crack under candlelight. A queen's appearance was not just hers, it was a national performance, one that had economic ripples. France's fashion industry thrived because the queen flaunted its products, but resentment brewed when the cost became impossible to ignore. Pamphleteers exaggerated her spending, dubbing her Madame Deficit, and soon clothing became evidence in the trial of public opinion. Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette's extravagance was truly ruinous or merely symbolic. The royal court had always been expensive after all, but symbols matter, and when people are hungry, symbols become daggers. You trudge alongside this debate, recognizing how fragile reputations can be when woven from silk and stitched with rumor. Fringe stories swirl around her fashion, adding both absurdity and menace. It's whispered that one of her wig makers, overwhelmed by the Queen's demands, collapsed from exhaustion after spending 3 nights crafting a coiffure shaped like a battlefield victory. Another tale claims that rats were sometimes discovered nesting in the tallest wigs during warm seasons, though whether this is satire or fact remains delightfully unclear. Quirky asides like these only sharpen the contrast. While peasants trudged barefoot, the queen's head carried miniature ships made of silver wire and ostrich plumes. Yet the queen's fashion choices weren't only indulgence, they were strategy. Clothing allowed her to craft an identity, to maintain control in a court where every gesture was scrutinized. When she wished to appear maternal, she wore soft, flowing gowns. When she needed to assert authority, she returned to stiff brocades and jeweled bodices. These shifts in image could influence alliances, soothe tensions, or provoke outrage. It was performance art with deadly stakes. And speaking of performance, the court itself became a runway. Every morning, the lever, the queen's waking ritual, was attended by courtiers who studied her clothing as though reading political tea leaves. A misplaced ribbon could inspire speculation. A new gown could launch a trend across Europe. The courtiers then replicated these fashions, spending fortunes to keep up, driving debts ever higher. In this way, Versailles was both a palace and a theater, where appearances mattered more than substance, and everyone was both actor and audience. As you trudge deeper into this glittering masquerade, the absurdity only grows. Consider the Queen's Hamlet-inspired rustic retreat, the Hameau de la Reine, where she dressed in peasant costumes to play at simplicity. Imagine the Queen, draped in linen and straw hats, strolling among faux cottages with porcelain milk pails. To her, it was escapism, a retreat from suffocating court rituals. To her critics, it was mockery of real peasants' suffering, another nail in her public coffin. A muslin gown worn for leisure became propaganda in the hands of her enemies. The fashion wars extended beyond the palace, bleeding into pamphlets, caricatures, and scandal sheets. Seditious writers drew grotesque cartoons of the queen, exaggerating her wigs into mountains, her gowns into monsters, her body into vulgar jokes. These images were weapons, cutting deeper than swords, shaping public perception with ink and ridicule. In a society boiling with unrest, fabric became a metaphor, light, frivolous, costly, and unsustainable. Historians still argue how much blame should be placed on Marie Antoinette for her choices. Was she a victim of misogynistic caricature, scapegoated for a collapsing monarchy? Or was she truly reckless, blind to the suffering outside Versailles? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, stitched together like one of her gowns, part silk and part shadow. You trudge past this opulent wardrobe in your mind, pausing at the irony. While courtiers obsessed over lace and embroidery, France itself unraveled. Yet, in another sense, it makes perfect sense. Clothing was never just clothing here. There was politics, economics, theater, and survival. A queen could lose her head over a dress, quite literally. And perhaps the strangest detail of all, even at the guillotine, Marie Antoinette's appearance mattered. Eyewitnesses say she dressed in plain white, dignified and calm, a final performance for history's stage. Fashion had been her weapon, her burden, her undoing, and in the end it was also her shroud. So, as you trudge away from Versailles' glittering halls of fabric and perfume, you're left with the uneasy realization that scandals are rarely about what they appear to be. Poisons are not only in cups but in rumors. Death comes not only from plots but from symbols. In fashion, that fluttering veil can hide daggers sharper than steel. The scandals of Versailles remind us that history is not just written in treaties or battles, it is embroidered in gowns, powdered in wigs, whispered through hallways, and painted on canvases. The palace may gleam with chandeliers, but its shadows are stitched with scandal, every seam tugging at the fragile fabric of power. You trudge onward, knowing the story of Versailles is not one of luxury alone, but of fear, ambition, and spectacle, where even a shoe buckle could spark a rumor and the muslin gown could become a revolution's spark. You drift further into the echoing corridors of Versailles, and the scent shifts no longer powder and perfume, but something sharper, metallic, like the glint of a blade or the sparkle of a jewel. This is where one of the most infamous scandals unfurls, the affair of the diamond necklace, a glittering disaster that nearly sparkled the monarchy right off its pedestal. Picture it, an enormous necklace, heavy with diamonds, so dazzling it looked less like jewelry and more like someone had strapped the Milky Way around your neck. Crafted by jewelers Boma and Bassange, it was designed years earlier for Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry. After his death, no one wanted to touch it, too gaudy, too tainted by association. The jewelers, desperate to unload their creation and drowning in debt, saw in Marie Antoinette their golden ticket, but the queen, already battling her reputation as Madame Deficit, refused. Owning such a monstrosity would confirm every pamphlet accusing her of bankrupting France just to shimmer in candlelight.
And yet the necklace found its way into scandal anyway. Enter Jeanne de la Motte, a con woman with aristocratic pretensions, and Cardinal de Rohan, a clergyman desperate to crawl back into the queen's good graces. You trudge into the story like it's a stage. Farce accept the punchline will topple reputations. Jan convinced Rowan that she had the queen's ear, that reconciliation was possible, and that a romantic liaison between the cardinal and the queen might even blossom. To sweeten the illusion, Jan enlisted an actress who resembled Marie Antoinette for a moonlit meeting in the gardens. Historians still argue whether Rowan truly believed he was speaking to the queen that night, or if he simply wanted to believe so badly that reality blurred under moonlight. Now here's the hook. Jeanne persuaded Rohan to act as an intermediary in acquiring the diamond necklace for the queen. The cardinal, eager to please, arranged the purchase, convinced he was helping restore her honor. The necklace vanished into the hands of Jeanne and her accomplices, who promptly dismantled it, selling the diamonds across Europe like candy at a market stall. When the fraud unraveled, Versailles didn't laugh. It boiled. Imagine being Marie Antoinette, waking up to discover half the kingdom now believed you had orchestrated this theft yourself, that you had manipulated a clergyman, that you had secretly lusted after a necklace you had publicly rejected. The scandal landed with the weight of a guillotine. Even though she was innocent, public opinion clung to the image of the queen as deceitful, greedy, and shameless. You trudge mentally through pamphlets printed after the affair. They show Marie Antoinette dripping with diamonds, cavorting with priests, mocking the suffering of France. The truth hardly mattered. The joke was too good, the story too delicious, the caricature too easy to draw. A queen who played milkmaid in her gardens now played jewel thief in the public imagination. Quirky side note, the actress who impersonated the queen in that fateful garden meeting supposedly had no idea she was stepping into history. Paid a small fee to play her role, she later confessed she thought it was merely a theatrical prank, like an aristocratic version of a street performance. And Rowan, blinded by ego, perhaps didn't notice or didn't care that her curtsy was a little too clumsy, her voice a little too common. The diamond necklace itself became more than an accessory, it was evidence. During the trials, it glittered like a cursed relic, passed from hand to hand while lawyers droned on, courtiers gasped, and pamphleteers sharpened their quills. And yet the necklace itself had almost no value by this point. The diamonds had been scattered, their sparkle diluted. What remained was the idea of it, the ghost of luxury, the symbol of a monarchy out of touch. Historians still argue about whether this affair alone fatally wounded Marie Antoinette's reputation or whether it merely accelerated a decline already in motion, but there's little debate that it fueled revolutionary anger. When peasants trudged through mud with nothing to eat, the thought of their queen scheming for diamonds was enough to ignite fury. Even innocence looked like guilt when framed by rumor. And here's the sardonic twist: Marie Antoinette wanted nothing to do with the necklace. She thought it hideous. But history rarely cares about your taste in jewelry. What matters is how people believe your story, how scandal fills the gaps in truth. You can almost chuckle at the irony, except you realize this joke left heads rolling. You trudge back through Versailles gilded halls where chandeliers still glitter, but now they seem less like light and more like accusation. Every sparkle, every jewel, every polished surface becomes a reminder. Symbols can destroy as surely as swords. The diamond necklace, meant to be a crown jewel of craftsmanship, instead became a chain dragging the monarchy toward collapse. And the best detail: after all this, the jewelers never recovered. Their masterpiece ruined them. The con woman Jeanne de la Motte escaped prison, only to D under mysterious circumstances in London, reportedly falling or leaping from a window. Rohan was acquitted, but his reputation never healed. And Marie Antoinette, acquitted by the court of public law, was convicted by the court of public opinion, a verdict harsher than any tribunal could issue. So you trudge on, the glitter of diamonds fading into shadow, realizing that Versailles' greatest scandals were not always about truth, but about spectacle. A necklace became a noose, a queen, as silence became guilt. And the people, hungry and furious, found in jewels the perfect symbol of everything that had gone wrong.
You trudge deeper into the marble corridors, and suddenly the air feels less perfumed, less gilded, and far more toxic. Forget diamonds and muslin gowns for a moment. This is the world of lampoons, pamphlets, and caricatures, where ink became a weapon sharper than any dagger, and gossip could ruin a queen faster than bankruptcy ever could. Welcome to the scandal-ridden universe of the libels, the underground literature of 18th century France. Imagine slipping under your bed covers at night, a smuggled pamphlet in hand, the candle guttering low, while scandalous tales about your monarchs are whispered across the pages. These weren't dry political tracts, they were juicy, often pornographic fictions masquerading as fact, filled with details that even HBO would hesitate to dramatize. And almost every one of them had Marie Antoinette front and center, cast as the villainess of a national soap opera. The queen was accused of everything from lesbian affairs with her ladies-in-waiting to plotting with foreign powers, from gambling away France's treasury to cavorting with stable boys. Some pamphlets claimed she bathed in donkey's milk, others that she arranged orgies in Versailles, disguised as masquerade balls. Historians still argue whether these libels represented genuine political critique or were simply sensational smut, but their effect was devastating either way. You trudge through the marketplace of ideas where such pamphlets were sold not in glittering bookstores but in smoky cafes, on street corners, passed hand to hand like contraband. For the common reader, many of whom had never seen Versailles, these stories painted the palace in lurid colors. Truth blurred with fiction until no one cared what was real. Why bother with nuance when you could picture the queen in yet another scandalous tableau? One quirky detail that still baffles researchers: some pamphlets were illustrated with crude woodcuts that recycled the same stock images. A noble woman depicted in one scandal might pop up in another, unchanged except for a new caption. So if you trudge through enough pamphlets, you'll see the same wide-eyed lady accused of seducing her guards one week and conspiring with Jesuits the next. It's like a bad meme template of the 18th century, same picture, different scandal. What makes this world both hilarious and chilling is how the public devoured it. Think of it like an 18th century TikTok feed: short, addictive, outrageous, and impossible to fact check. Every new libel was like a viral post, spreading whispers through Paris, reaching cafes, salons, and eventually peasant villages. Literacy rates were rising, so more people could consume these stories firsthand. For those who couldn't, readings were staged aloud in taverns, the audience roaring at tales of the Queen's supposed debauchery. And here's the sharper twist: the monarchy was supposed to stand for sacred dignity. Yet dignity crumbled when the Queen was mocked as a frivolous puppet of Austria. Each pamphlet dragged her down from a near divine pedestal to the level of a public joke. They chipped away at the royal aura, undoing centuries of carefully built mystique. Historians still debate whether these scandal sheets were coordinated by revolutionary groups or just churned out by opportunistic publishers looking for profit. Either way, the impact was devastating. Just as France slid toward bankruptcy, the pamphlets gave the angry public a perfect target: Marie Antoinette. She wasn't merely disliked, she was despised. The press slapped her with the cruel nickname, the Austrian whore. And once that image took hold, every new rumor seemed to confirm it. You trudge into one especially notorious pamphlet, Le Livre de la Reine. It purported to reveal the Queen's intimate mourning rituals, describing in lurid detail how she supposedly entertained multiple lovers in her chambers. The reality was far duller. Her mornings were ceremonial affairs attended by ladies, pages, and chambermaids, all under public scrutiny. But readers preferred the fantasy. They weren't interested in etiquette manuals. They wanted scandals served sizzling hot. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some pamphleteers claimed they had inside sources at Versailles, maids, guards, or courtiers willing to leak secrets. But when historians sifted through the evidence later, many of these sources turned out to be fabricated personas invented to lend credibility. It's the 18th century equivalent of a reliable insider says posts online today. The playbook hasn't changed, only the platforms. The sheer volume of this propaganda was staggering. Thousands of pamphlets circulated each year, each one gnawing away at the monarchy's legitimacy. For every dry essay on taxation, there were 10 scandal sheets describing the Queen's supposed latest tryst. When you picture the revolution brewing, don't imagine only starving peasants. It was also fueled by readers smirking over bedtime stories of their queen behaving badly. And yet, for all their absurdity, the pamphlets had teeth. They shaped public memory. Even today, when people picture Marie Antoinette as decadent and disconnected, they are often channeling the shadows of these libels. Historians still argue whether the Queen ever had affairs. Most serious scholars say no evidence exists. But the perception mattered more than the truth. Once a rumor takes hold, it becomes as solid as stone. You trudge back from the tavern, the pamphlet's ink still smudging your fingers, realizing the monarchy was already on trial in the court of public opinion long before 1789. No jury, no lawyers, no defense, just gossip, caricature, and scandal. And here's the sardonic twist. In a society where actual political participation was limited, these pamphlets became a form of democratic engagement. Ordinary Parisians who had no voice in government could at least laugh at their rulers and share a sense of collective mockery. The king might have armies, but the people had satire, and satire is harder to silence than muskets. By the time the revolution erupted, the monarchy's dignity was in tatters. When Marie Antoinette stood trial in 1793, prosecutors leaned heavily on her reputation as built by decades of libels. The most shocking accusation, that she had committed incest with her young son, echoed directly from earlier pamphlets. She wept when she heard it, but the damage was done. A lie, whispered often enough, becomes truth in the ears of history. So you trudge onward, recognizing that ink and rumor can be more corrosive than gunpowder. Scandals are not always about what happened, they are about what people believe. And in this case, belief toppled the queen long before the blade ever did. You shuffle along in your mind's tour of Versailles, and now the laughter of pamphleteers fades into something more bitter, almost metallic in its taste: betrayal, conspiracy, and whispers of treason. For years, The queen was accused of being less French than Austrian, less devoted to her adopted country than to the Habsburg family she left behind. In courtly gossip, she was la Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, which with a twist of pronunciation also sounded like chien, or dog. It's one of those cruel linguistic coincidences that sticks like a burr. Picture her arrival in France, a 14-year-old girl sent from Vienna to secure an alliance between two old enemies. Her carriage stopped at the border, where she was stripped of her Austrian clothing and redressed in French finery. It was meant as a symbolic rebirth, but the symbolism clung in the opposite direction. For decades afterward, whenever anything went wrong, people whispered that she was still Austrian under the silks. And when France found itself sliding into war with Austria, the suspicion hardened into something close to paranoia. You can almost hear the murmurs in the salons. She's feeding our secrets to Vienna. She's more empress than queen. She's bleeding us dry for her brother's sake. Historians still argue whether her influence on foreign policy was substantial or superficial. Some claim she begged her husband to avoid war, others that she schemed for Austrian interest behind the scenes. Either way, once the idea stuck, her enemies didn't need proof. The quirky twist is that she did, in fact, exchange a steady stream of letters with her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and later her brother Joseph II. These weren't encrypted espionage notes. Most were scolding pep talks. Her mother criticized her for not producing heirs quickly enough, for overspending, for failing to charm her husband into political assertiveness. Imagine being Queen of France and still getting nagged in the mail like you'd forgotten to tidy your room. Still, secrecy has a way of attracting scandal. Some letters were intercepted, and while most contained nothing more nefarious than family updates and gentle pleas, the very fact that the Queen was writing privately to Austria fueled the narrative of betrayal. You trudge through the archives, picturing ministers poring over her handwriting, squinting for hidden codes where there were none. Not everything about her story was harmless. When the revolution grew close, Marie Antoinette did try to reach out to Austria and Prussia for help in protecting the French crown. To her, it was survival. To her critics, it was undeniable proof of treason. The famous flight to Varennes in 1791, when the royal family attempted to escape Paris to gather support, only deepened suspicion. The queen wore plain clothes as a disguise, but small habits gave her away. She reportedly demanded a larger carriage so she could bring extra comforts. That choice slowed the journey and made it more obvious. It became one of the clumsiest escapes in history. One odd little detail from that night. At a posting inn, their carriage was delayed because the horses weren't ready. Worse, the innkeeper is said to have recognized the king's face from coins. Imagine being exposed by your own money. It's like trying to sneak out while holding a giant sign with your portrait. When the family was captured and dragged back to Paris, suspicion turned to open hostility. Pamphlets now painted the queen not only as a spendthrift, but also as a traitor, plotting with foreign armies. Historians still debate whether the revolutionaries truly believed she had dangerous influence or simply used her as a symbol to inflame anger. Either way, her foreign loyalties became part of her permanent image. It wasn't just gossip. Politicians in the National Assembly questioned whether France could ever be secure while she remained alive. At her trial, prosecutors repeated the same themes again and again. She was foreign, she was draining the kingdom's wealth, she was feeding secrets to Vienna. In the logic of the revolution, this made her not only unpopular, but a threat to the very existence of the new France. Here's the irony. Marie Antoinette, accused of masterminding treason, often had trouble even influencing her husband. Records show that ministers ignored her advice more often than not, dismissing her as meddling or inexperienced. She was far from a puppet master sometimes. She was simply the voice in the corner, raising concerns that went unheard. But scandal doesn't allow for nuance. As you picture revolutionary Paris, the atmosphere feels tense. Citizens whisper in taverns, newspapers scream accusations of betrayal, and soldiers march through the streets with sharpened pikes, convinced they are defending France from its Austrian queen. Fear condensed itself into her body, her accent, her foreign birth. Historians still argue whether her death was unavoidable once suspicion hardened. Some say that if she had not been Austrian, she might have survived as a powerless figurehead. Others insist the revolution required an enemy, and she was too useful a villain to let live. And so the story wins on. Versailles' greatest scandals were not only about jewels or dresses, they were about identity, trust, and fear. A muslin gown could spark outrage, but even a whisper of betrayal could shatter a throne. The saddest irony for Marie Antoinette is this: the girl stripped at the border to become French was never allowed to shed Austria from her skin. As whispers filled the candlelit salons of Paris, another shadow of scandal hovered over Versailles, the hidden rituals of the French court. You see, life inside the palace wasn't only about politics and luxury, it was about performance. Every gesture, every bow, every smile was rehearsed like a play. Even waking up the king was a ceremony called lever. Imagine dozens of nobles crowding into a bedroom just to watch the monarch rise, stretch, and get dressed. To outsiders, this seemed absurd, even scandalous, a royal life stripped of privacy, reduced to ritual. But for courtiers, being part of these daily ceremonies was the only way to stay close to power. Now, you may ask, wasn't it exhausting to live under such constant observation? Absolutely. Many nobles resented it, and gossip became their weapon. If you couldn't outshine someone in rank, you could tarnish them with rumor. Versailles was a golden cage, and scandal was the only tool for survival. One of the more peculiar customs revolved around food. Imagine being Marie Antoinette, always watched as you dined at the Grand Couvert, a public meal where nobles and even ordinary people could watch you eat. For the queen, every bite, every sip of wine became symbolic. If she looked too indulgent, whispers called her greedy. If she ate too little, they claimed she was ill or ungrateful. The simple act of dining turned into a performance fraught with the possibility of scandal. And then came the love triangles. Ah, these were the lifeblood of Versailles gossip. Nobles competed fiercely for royal affection, and jealousy burned like wildfire. Letters were forged, secret notes were slipped into sleeves, and alliances rose and fell in a matter of weeks. Some historians even claim that Louis XV's favor toward one mistress could spark jealousy intense enough to influence foreign policy. Personal relationships at court were never truly private. They were threads woven into the kingdom's destiny. Among the most infamous webs of intrigue was the rivalry between Marie Antoinette and the king's mistresses, or at least the lingering shadow of them. Even after Louis XVI proved himself faithful, people preferred the scandalous narrative. They whispered of hidden liaisons, of the queen's supposed affairs with courtiers and even foreign dignitaries. Most of it was fiction, but in a world fueled by rumor, truth mattered less than sensation. Of course, not all scandals were about love or jewels. Some were about rebellion. Certain princes and dukes openly defied the crown, leaving France to conspire abroad. Each defection was like a dagger pointed at the monarchy, reminding everyone that loyalty within the royal family was far from guaranteed. But what truly shocked the people was the mixing of financial fraud with family drama. Remember the diamond necklace affair? That was just one glittering example. Beyond it lay countless small scandals, embezzlement of court funds, suspicious contracts, bribes hidden beneath polite exchanges. Versailles sparkled with chandeliers, but behind the shine were debts, secret loans, and desperate attempts to cover the costs of luxury. The public began to see Versailles as not only a palace of splendor, but also a palace of deception. Pamphlets circulated, filled with biting satire. Caricatures of the queen depicted her as a glutton, a flirt, or a schemer. Even the king was drawn as weak, manipulated by those around him. These weren't just jokes, they were weapons, eroding the sacred aura of royalty. And then came the trials, the humiliations, and the cracks in the dynasty. Once the revolution ignited, old scandals resurfaced like ghosts. Marie Antoinette's reputation as a spendthrift was paraded in court as evidence of her guilt. The whispers of her supposed affairs became part of the case against her. She was not judged only as a queen, but as the villain of countless stories spread years before. Think of it this way: the monarchy wasn't toppled by swords alone. It was weakened first by whispers, by rumors, by the endless drip of scandal that drained away its dignity. By the time the guillotine's blade fell, the legacy of French royalty was already stained. To this day, when people think of Versailles, they recall not only its mirrors and gardens, but also its betrayals and lies. And that, perhaps, is the greatest scandal of all. For in the quiet of history's night, the French royal family reminds us of a timeless truth. Power may glitter, but scandal lingers longer than gold. You find yourself in a dim corridor where candlelight flickers against cool stone, shadows elongating like whispers stretched too far. The palace is no longer buzzing with laughter or the rustle of silks. Instead, it carries an uneasy hush, as though every footstep echoes with impending judgment. Versailles, once the gilded jewel of Europe, is trembling under the weight of public outrage, and tonight you wander straight into the spectacle of trials and humiliations, the great unraveling of the royal family's carefully polished image. You pause by a window, the air cold against your cheek, and you imagine the shouts outside the palace gates. Ordinary Parisians, tired of bread shortages and rising taxes, clamor for accountability, and their voices seep into the royal chambers like a tide that can no longer be held back. The scandals you've trailed up until now, secret affairs, diamond necklaces, gambling debts, whisper networks of pamphleteers, are no longer amusing tales murmured by courtiers. They have grown claws, transformed into evidence, accusations, and courtroom drama that captures the imagination of the entire world. The affair of the diamond necklace, which you already tiptoed through earlier, has not faded away like an embarrassing rumor. Instead, it becomes Exhibit A in a growing narrative. The monarchy is decadent, deceitful, and out of touch. You picture Marie Antoinette, once the glittering queen who redefined fashion with her towering hairstyles and gauzy gowns, now being depicted as Madame Déficit, the villain of every bread riot. Historians still argue whether her reputation was genuinely earned or cruelly manufactured, but you can almost feel the heavy weight of caricatures and lampoons being passed around taverns and marketplaces, each crude drawing slicing away at her dignity. And then comes the revolution. You don't watch it like a textbook event, you feel it like a rising fever in the city's bloodstream. The Bastille falls, heads roll, and Versailles itself becomes a haunted relic, its halls echoing not with music but with dread. The royal family is dragged into Paris, housed in the Tuileries, their gilded isolation shattered. Imagine the sheer humiliation. A queen once surrounded by diamonds, now rationing candles, her laughter replaced with the scratch of quills drafting desperate letters to foreign allies. The trials begin almost like theater. You take your seat not in plush velvet, but in a crowded hall where the air smells of sweat, ink, and fear. Louis XVI is brought forth, accused of conspiring against the people, of draining the kingdom's lifeblood through war and luxury. His powdered wig seems ridiculous in the harsh light of reality. You lean closer and hear him speak in calm, deliberate tones, insisting on his innocence, reminding the court of his intentions. And yet, no matter what words he chooses, you sense the verdict is already written in the faces of the jurors, etched in the chants of the crowd. One quirky detail you can't shake. During his final days, Louis insisted on keeping his pocket watch close by, checking it as though punctuality still mattered in the shadow of a guillotine. Historians still argue whether this revealed his steadfast composure or his sheer inability to grasp the enormity of his downfall. But to you, standing in that crowded courtroom, it feels oddly human, like a man clinging to the last shred of order in a collapsing world. The trial of Marie Antoinette is even crueler. If Louis's humiliation is political, hers is deeply personal. She stands accused not just of treason, but of moral corruption, of being a foreign harpy who drained France's wealth for her Austrian relatives. Satirical pamphlets that once snickered about her dresses now scream about her supposed debauchery. One particularly vicious charge accuses her of corrupting her own son, a claim that even revolutionaries later admitted was likely fabricated. Still, the damage is done. You imagine her standing there, pale but composed, her famous poise reduced to a mask against relentless accusations. There's a chilling quiet as you picture her facing her accusers. The whispers of powdered wigs, the scratch of quills, the murmurs of the audience, it all slows down, becomes surreal. Historians still argue whether her final dignity was an act of defiance or simply resignation. But to you, watching from the shadowy corner of the courtroom, it feels almost like the last performance of a queen who once lived her entire life on display. The humiliation doesn't end with the monarchs. The extended royal family, too, faces their share of ridicule and judgment. Princes are exiled, cousins arrested, noble titles stripped away like costumes after a masquerade. Some flee across borders, seeking refuge in Austria, England, or Prussia, where they spend their days plotting futile restorations and writing bitter memoirs. You picture one such prince hunched over a desk in Vienna, candle guttering as he scribbles venomous lines about that Austrian woman who ruined everything. In exile, their scandals become bedtime gossip for foreign courts, another form of entertainment in Europe's grand theater of politics. One fringe story you stumble across makes you pause. A rumor that Louis XVI secretly baked bread in his final weeks, an attempt to redeem himself in the eyes of the people. There's no evidence, of course, and historians still argue whether this was revolutionary propaganda or a desperate act of humanity. But you can almost picture the king in an apron, flour dusting his powdered wig, kneading dough in a cold kitchen, while gods look on in disbelief. It's absurd, tender, and heartbreaking all at once, the kind of image that clings to your mind long after you leave the trial behind. As you continue to wander the corridors of memory, the trials unfold like a morality play with a predetermined ending. The guillotine waits, its blade glinting in the winter Sunday. Crowds gather in the thousands, eager to witness not just executions, but the final humiliation of a family that once ruled with divine authority. You stand among them, the smell of damp wool and roasting chestnuts in the air, and you hear the drum rolls drown out the prayers. The king ascends the scaffold, speaks his final words, and for a moment there's a hush, as if time itself pauses to listen. Then the blade falls, and history lurches forward. Marie Antoinette follows months later, her once lavish hair now cut short, her gown plain, her carriage ride silent except for the jeers of the crowd. You walk beside her, imagining the jostling of the cart, the rough cobblestones under the wheels, the cold wind against her face. When she steps onto the scaffold, she accidentally treads on her executioner's foot and whispers an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to." That tiny moment of politeness in the face of death lingers like a ghost. Historians still argue whether it was sincere courtesy or deliberate composure, but either way, it remains a final scandalous paradox. A queen condemned as monstrous, remembered instead for her grace. By the time you leave the square, the shouting still echoing in your ears, you realize that the greatest scandal of all isn't the affairs, the jewels, or the debts, it's the collapse of the illusion itself. The royal family, once untouchable, is dragged down into the mud of public judgment. Their humiliations become the people's entertainment, their downfall the people's catharsis. Versailles is no longer a dream of gold and mirrors. It is a cautionary tale whispered into the night. And so you wander on, your steps quieter now, the scandals heavier on your shoulders. You've seen the family stripped bare, tried not just by jurors, but by history itself. And as you drift deeper into the palace's silent wings, you can almost hear the walls sigh. Even the brightest crowns eventually tarnish. Even the grandest courts crumble under the weight of their own secrets. You drift through Versailles as though the marble floors themselves are sighing, the gilded doors groaning under centuries of memory. Tonight the palace is quieter, emptier, and you can almost sense the absence of those who once filled these rooms with their laughter, their intrigue, and their arrogance. The revolution has ripped the family from their seats of power, and now you trace the faint aftershocks, princes in exile, cousins scattered across Europe, and betrayals that sting more sharply than any blade. The story doesn't end with the guillotine. That's the easy image, the clean cut. What follows is murkier, stretched out like a shadow at dusk. The surviving Bourbons scatter like startled birds, wings flapping toward Vienna, London, Turin, or Brussels. Each one carries not only the memory of what was lost, but the burden of what must come next. You feel their fear and their arrogance all tangled together. The odd sensation of nobles who once believed themselves immortal, now reduced to begging favors from foreign courts. Louis XVI's brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, make particularly colorful figures. Provence, later to be crowned Louis XVIII, has the polished manners of a man who knows how to smile through humiliation. He waits in the wings, cautious, writing endless letters filled with careful schemes, always insisting that he alone is the rightful head of the family. You picture him hunched over a desk in exile, the scratch of the quill echoing through the silence of a rented room in Verona, wax seals pressed with too much flourish, as though pomp could disguise desperation. Historians still argue whether his restraint was wisdom or cowardice, but either way, his survival proves remarkable. Artois, by contrast, storms through Europe like a man perpetually offended by reality. He struts into foreign salons, railing against the revolutionaries, demanding armies and money. His powdered wig tilts precariously as he gestures with a cane, declaring that France must be rescued immediately. Courtiers politely nod while quietly pocketing his desperation. You can almost smell the wine on his breath, hear the overconfident clatter of his boots on polished floors. Some say he charmed women into funding his exile. Others claim he squandered fortunes on gambling tables. Either way, you see a man so determined to return home that he ignores the absurdity of his situation, an heir without a throne, shouting in a borrowed drawing room, and betrayal seeps through these exiles like smoke under a door. Families fracture when survival is at stake. Cousins whisper about each other's loyalties. Some declare undying devotion to monarchy, while others strike deals with revolutionary France to preserve their lands. You imagine the awkward dinners in Austrian palaces, where Bourbon cousins glare at one another across gilded tables, each secretly suspecting the other of treachery. The forks clink too loudly, the candles burn too low, and beneath the surface of polite conversation simmers a rage that no amount of etiquette can smother. One fringe tale from this era has a particularly bitter taste. Supposedly, a French noble disguised himself as a traveling harpist, slipping into revolutionary Paris to spy on his own relatives. He would perform in taverns, plucking soft melodies while listening for gossip about the Bourbons. The story might be exaggerated, but you can almost picture the scene, the soft twang of strings mixing with the rough laughter of drinkers, a prince's fingers trembling not from the music but from the terror of being recognized. Historians still argue whether such spies existed or if these stories are just romantic flourishes added later. Either way, the image lingers, absurd and heartbreaking. Exiled nobles filled their days with endless letters and proclamations. You can almost see the parchments stacked high, ink staining their hands, each page mixing pride with desperation. They swore they would return, that the revolution was only a passing storm, that the people longed for their return. But as months turned into years, their words grew more anxious, their promises more dramatic. Some dreamed of bold reforms, others spoke of revenge, but all seemed trapped in a cycle of hope and delay. Imagine the restless scratching of quills, the sound of determination slowly wearing thin. Back in France, loyalty was a dangerous gamble. Families who once celebrated together found themselves divided, with relatives testifying against one another. Grand houses were seized, titles erased, names stained by suspicion. Picture a once proud chateau now stripped bare, its walls empty where portraits once hung, its gardens overgrown, the air filled with silence instead of music. In such places, survival mattered more than honor, and silence became its own form of currency. Even abroad, whispers of intrigue followed the exiles. Some earned reputations for indulgence, lavish hunts, endless salons, extravagant dinners, while letters from struggling fellow emigres went unanswered. The contrast was striking. Men dreaming of restoration while still clinging to the very habits that had weakened their cause. And then came the slow betrayal of memory. Some began reshaping their own stories, polishing their reputations, exaggerating courage, softening their faults. They told and retold their pasts by candlelight, adjusting details with every version. Were these memoirs truth or performance? Historians still debate it, but the image is clear. Exiles carefully rewriting their lives for the future they longed to see. The farther you drift into their world, the heavier the loneliness feels. Their palaces were borrowed, their feasts polite but hollow. Surrounded by wealth, they still seemed like actors with no stage. They toasted France, but the wine left a bitter taste. They drew plans for a return that never came, spoke of dynasties while watching their families scatter across Europe. Standing before a tall mirror in some foreign hall, you can almost imagine them asking, "Who am I without my crown? Who am I when my people no longer see me as their ruler?" In that question lies the quietest scandal of all, not treachery, but irrelevance. By the time you step back into Versailles, its corridors seem emptier than ever. The echoes of laughter have faded, the schemes dissolved, the mirrors reflecting only silence. And you realize that exile itself was less a punishment than a slow unraveling, turning once mighty figures into shadows of what they had been. You wander deeper into the quiet heart of Versailles, where the candlelight seems to flicker with unease, and the shadows grow long and nervous. The marble floors echo faintly under your steps, and for a moment you wonder if it's your own heartbeat you hear, or the restless whispers of a palace haunted not by ghosts, but by the rumors of poisonings and secret deaths. Scandal here isn't only whispered between lovers or inked into lampoons, it's also hidden in the bottom of goblets, in the faint powder sprinkled on sugared almonds, in the sudden fevers that strike without warning. Death in the French royal family always drew attention, but suspicious death that was practically a spectator sport. Your journey begins with the infamous affair of the poisons in the late 17th century. Under Louis XIV, you slip into a dark chamber thick with incense and candle smoke, where fortune tellers and alchemists sell powders with promises, some for love, others for death. Paris is crawling with clandestine sorcerers, and their potions make their way to the highest echelons of society. Suddenly, courtiers whisper that rivals are being quietly removed, one sip of wine at a time. The scandal grows so large that even Madame de Montespan, the Sun King's celebrated mistress, is accused of dabbling in black masses and love philters. Historians still argue whether her involvement was real or fabricated by jealous enemies, but the very fact that her name lingered in the accusations shows how close the poison panic came to the royal bedchamber. Imagine the scene: Montespan in her jewel-draped gown, staring down her enemies while pamphlets outside accuse her of sacrificing infants to secure her place at the king's side. The absurdity of it makes you shake your head. Versailles, with its golden fountains and endless mirrors, hiding stories of frogs' blood and whispered curses. Fringe tidbits suggest poisoned gloves, perfumed powders slipped into wigs, and even enchanted wax figures buried in secret gardens. Whether or not the details were true, the paranoia was real, and you can almost feel the courtiers glancing nervously at their wine cups. As the decades roll on, poison remains the go-to explanation for any untimely death. A prince dies suddenly of stomach pains? Poison. A noblewoman collapses after a feast? Poison. The air around Versailles becomes thick with suspicion, each death fueling gossip more than grief. You picture nobles leaning in close, fanning themselves dramatically, whispering, "She looked pale at dinner, didn't she?" One almost expects the walls themselves to keep a ledger of rumored poisons, tallying the names of the supposedly damned. Even into the 18th century, the whispers continue. The young Louis Joseph, Dauphin of France, the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, dies at the tender age of 7. Officially, it's tuberculosis. But in taverns and pamphlets, the word is poison. Revolutionaries mutter that enemies of the crown celebrated the child's death, while royalists whisper that Jacobin agitators struck early. Historians still argue whether tuberculosis alone explains the boy's decline or whether darker forces hastened it. For you, wandering past the gilded nursery doors, the silence of the empty cradle feels heavier than any verdict. Then comes the tale of the Duke of Burgundy, another heir whose death at age 29 sparks suspicion. His sudden illness and rapid decline in 1712 unleash another storm of theories. Some say smallpox, others whisper of poisoned chocolate delivered by jealous rivals who feared his reformist streak. Picture him in a brocaded chair, hands trembling as he lifts the cup to his lips, while courtiers exchange loaded glances. Chocolate sweet, exotic, luxurious, turned into a suspected murder weapon. You almost can't take a sip of cocoa without thinking twice. And Marie Antoinette herself, the queen already shredded by scandal, isn't spared the poison whispers. In her final days at the conciergerie, when she suffers fainting spells and weakness, some claim she was quietly poisoned by guards who feared her martyrdom. Others believe she poisoned herself to escape humiliation, though the evidence suggests her health simply crumbled under stress and confinement. Historians still argue, but you imagine the bitter irony. A queen once accused of poisoning others, now rumored to be poisoned in her last hours. The strangest detail, though, lies in the public's imagination. Parisian markets sold amulets against poison, made of exotic stones or shaped like tiny toads. Some nobles carried bezoar stones, said to neutralize any venom, and dropped them theatrically into cups of wine before drinking. Imagine that raising a toast and plunking a stone into your glass like a medieval cocktail garnish. It's both comical and tragic, the desperate gestures of people who know their world is built on suspicion. And then there are the poison trials, whispered accusations turned into courtroom dramas, servants hauled before judges, accused of slipping powders into soups, confessing under torture. Some trials ended with executions, others with exiles. Each one fueled the belief that the court itself was rotten to the core, that beneath the diamonds and silks lurked the kingdom of poisoners. You shiver at the thought of dining at Versailles, never sure if the glistening sauce on your venison might be your last. The revolution itself becomes soaked in these rumors. As guillotines rise in Paris, nobles whisper that Robespierre and his allies are poisoning enemies in prison cells to speed the blade's work. Robespierre's own sudden collapse before his execution sparks one last poison theory. Was it a self-inflicted dose, or the convenient work of a rival? Historians still argue, but as you wander through these stories, you sense poison isn't just about death. It's about power, fear, and the thrill of scandal that refuses to die. You pause near a banquet table long abandoned, the silverware tarnished, the dishes cold. You imagine the laughter of guests, the clinking of crystal goblets, the heavy perfume of roasted meats and sugared fruits. But beneath it all, you hear the unspoken dread. Every toast could be a test, every swallow a gamble. The rumors of poisonings and secret deaths turn dinner into theater, survival into suspense. As you move away, the silence presses closer. You realize that in the Grand Palace of Versailles, poison wasn't just a rumor, it was a metaphor, a way for people to explain the slow rot of a monarchy that looked untouchable but was already dying from within. And whether the victims fell to illness, betrayal, or actual venom, the scandal always tasted the same: bitter, intoxicating, unforgettable. You wander deeper into the palace corridors, the tapestries dim under candlelight, as though they too are bracing for the kind of tale that makes reputations crumble faster than a stale croissant. Your feet scuff against marble that has heard whispers far juicier than any reality show confessionals, and tonight's scandal is perhaps the juiciest of all the infamous diamond necklace affair. Even if you've never brushed up against French history before, you've probably heard a faint sparkle of this story, the one that draped Marie Antoinette in suspicion like a necklace of doom. Imagine this, a necklace so extravagant that it required nearly 30 years of craftsmanship, hundreds of diamonds, and enough sparkle to light up a ballroom without a single candle. The jewelers who created it dreamed of draping it around the neck of Madame du Barry, Louis XV's mistress, but when the king inconveniently died before he could buy it, the poor jewelers were left with a necklace too gaudy even for an influencer unboxing video. For years, they tried to pawn it off like some over the top engagement ring on eBay, but no one bid. Enter the perfect storm, a cardinal desperate to restore his reputation, a clever con woman with the acting chops of Meryl Streep, and a queen whose reputation was already hanging by a silk thread. You pause at a window that overlooks the Cour d'Honneur. The moonlight seems to sketch out the scene for you. Cardinal de Rohan, strutting about in his red robes, eager to find a way back into the Queen's good graces. See, poor Rohan had once insulted Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and the Queen had never forgiven him. He was basically ghosted from court before ghosting was even trendy, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and Rohan wanted back in. Unfortunately for him, desperation has a certain smell, and Jean de Lamotte, our scammer extraordinaire, sniffed it out like a truffle pig in the forest. Now, Jean de Lamotte wasn't just some random trickster. She claimed descent from the Valois line, giving her just enough aristocratic sparkle to be dangerous in Versailles' pecking order. With debts piling up and a taste for luxury, she orchestrated a plot so bold it could only have succeeded in a palace already drowning in gossip. Jeannie convinced Rohan that she had a secret line of communication with Marie Antoinette. Think of it like those modern day scams where a Nigerian prince emails you promising riches, except here, the email was written in perfect lace handwriting, sealed with fake royal wax, and passed under candlelight. And poor Rohan, he bought it. Picture it. Midnight in the gardens of Versailles. Lanterns flicker, hedges loom, and a woman dressed as the queen herself drifts into view. She's not Marie Antoinette, of course, but a prostitute named Nicole d'Oliva, dolled up in the queen's signature white gown, a rose in her hand. To Rohan, blinded by hope and maybe a few too many glasses of wine, it's enough. He kneels, he hands over tokens of affection, and he leaves, believing that the queen has forgiven him. Historians still argue whether Rohan was truly that gullible, or whether he was so desperate he willingly suspended disbelief. Either way, you can't help but smirk, because let's be honest, if someone told you Beyonce wanted to meet you behind a hedge at midnight, you'd probably at least peek. Now here's the kicker. Jean convinces Rohan that the queen secretly desires that gaudy diamond necklace, but she can't be seen purchasing it herself because scandal. The solution? Rohan will act as the queen's intermediary, securing the necklace to prove his loyalty. You can almost hear the jewelers breathing a sigh of relief, polishing up their diamonds, thinking their financial nightmare is finally over. But as soon as the necklace changes hands, it vanishes straight into Jeannie's possession. She pawns off the stones one by one, living her best life, while Rohan struts around thinking he's the queen's secret knight in shining armor. Of course, secrets in Versailles travel about as slowly as a tweet goes viral today. Before long, the necklace is gone, Jean is flush with cash, and the whole scheme starts to wobble. When it unravels spectacularly. Rohan is arrested in full view of the court, dragged away in his cardinal robes, a scene so dramatic it could have been staged by Netflix. Jean is exposed as a con artist, but here's the twist. Marie Antoinette, who had absolutely nothing to do with the scam, ends up tarred by the scandal anyway. People already thought she was frivolous, decadent, out of touch, and here was a story that made her look like she'd been sneaking diamonds behind the nation's back. The trial that followed was less about truth and more about theater. Crowds gathered, pamphlets flew off the presses, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. Was the Queen complicit? Did she secretly orchestrate the whole affair? Or was she merely the unlucky victim of bad PR centuries before publicists could tweet clarifications? Historians still argue whether public hatred of Marie Antoinette would have reached boiling point without the diamond necklace affair. But what's clear is that this scandal sealed her fate in the eyes of the French people. From then on, she was forever the queen who ate cake, who wore diamonds while peasants starved, whether or not she ever touched the necklace at all. You stroll past the gilt mirror in the hallway, and for a moment, you imagine the reflection of a woman burdened by gossip she couldn't control. She isn't laughing in powdered wigs and twirling parasols like the cartoons in Paris pamphlets. She looks weary, cornered, and tragically unaware that history would turn her into a symbol of royal excess. The irony? The diamonds never glittered on her neck, not once. Yet the scandal clung tighter than any jewel ever could. As you keep walking, the palace seems to hum with the echoes of judgment. You hear faint chuckles, cruel and mocking, as if the ghosts of pamphleteers are still giggling over their caricatures of the queen. You hear the rustle of silk gowns in the gallery, whispers that grow sharper, heavier, until it feels like even the wallpaper is accusing you. That's the danger of scandal. It doesn't just live in courtrooms or ballrooms, it seeps into the walls, the air, the very fabric of memory. By now, your eyelids feel heavier. The story has wound itself into a kind of lullaby, even if it's spiked with scandal. You yawn because, as ridiculous as the affair was, it reminds you of something timeless. People love to believe the worst about those in power. A necklace, a forged letter, a midnight meeting. It's all it takes to tilt a kingdom. Versailles tonight feels less like a palace and more like a stage, and you've just watched one of history's most infamous plays unfold. You drift into the final wing of the palace, the air colder here, as if the stones themselves are bracing for the sound of distant drums and the thunder of a crowd. Versailles no longer feels like a glittering jewel box. It feels like a gilded cage trembling under the weight of footsteps that are not noble, not perfumed, not invited. Tonight, the whispers grow louder, sharper, and you can almost hear the chant that will soon shake the monarchy to its core. Bread, bread, bread. The scandals you've wandered through, the mistresses flaunting jewels, the whispers of illegitimate children, the frauds with diamond necklaces, all of them have piled like dry tinder. Now, in this final stretch, the spark comes. It isn't just gossip anymore. It isn't just pamphlets smudged with ink. It's hunger, it's rage, it's people staring at their empty tables while imagining the Queen's banquet. And you stand in the middle of the Hall of Mirrors, watching those mirrors reflect not courtly dances, but flames from torches carried by a mob. You hear it, October 1789, the Women's March on Versailles. Thousands of them, trudging through mud and rain, armed with whatever they could, carry pitchforks, knives, even pots and pans turned into makeshift drums. They're not here for jewels. They're not here to watch theater. They're here because their children cry at night from hunger. They're here because bread costs a fortune, while rumor has it that the Queen once mocked them with, "Let them eat cake." Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette ever uttered those infamous words, but it doesn't matter. In scandal, perception is reality, and reality is turned against her. You press your ear to the palace wall and hear the pounding of fists, the shouts that swell like waves. Inside, courtiers scatter like startled pigeons, silk slippers slipping on marble, wigs askew. Guards rush to lock doors, to form barricades, but it's no use. The mob breaches the palace. Blood stains the staircase. Screams echo through gilded corridors that once carried laughter. The queen herself flees to the king's chambers, barefoot, her nightgown whispering across the stone floors. Imagine it, the most glamorous woman in Europe, suddenly stripped of her stage, reduced to a mother clutching her children in the dark. The crowd demands to see her. They drag her to the balcony, where torches flicker below and thousands of faces, hard and furious, glare up at her. She stands tall, whatever her flaws. She has that much steel and bows her head. For a moment, the mob hushes. It is one of history's eerie pauses, the kind that make your spine tighten when rage and pity clash in the same breath. But the silence doesn't last. They want her in Paris. They want the king. The royal family is forced to leave Versailles that day, never to return. The palace, once a glittering scandal machine, falls silent, its mirrors gathering dust. You follow the carriage in your mind's eye. The king, pale and resigned. The queen, stiff-backed but trembling. The children, confused, clutching their toys. The Parisian streets swarm with people jeering, hurling insults, waving pikes. Some of those pikes carry severed heads, grisly reminders that this isn't gossip anymore. This is revolution. And revolution is never PG-13, no matter how softly you whisper it. The years blur. You see the king on trial, his crown stripped, his dignity reduced to paper ballots cast by men in assembly. You see Marie Antoinette in the conciergerie prison, her hair cropped short, her dress is plain, her face gaunt. Remember the necklace that never touched her skin? Remember the affair she never orchestrated? Those scandals cling tighter now than any jewel. Pamphlets still circulate, depicting her as a harlot, a traitor, a foreign parasite sucking France dry. Historians still argue whether the revolution could have succeeded without the scapegoat image of the queen. But what's certain is that she never escaped it. You close your eyes, and in the darkness behind your eyelids, you hear the heavy drumbeat of the guillotine square. The crowd gathers, restless, buzzing like hornets. The queen steps out, her hands bound, her dress simple. There is no powdered wig, no diamonds, no silken fan fluttering against her cheek. Just a woman, 37 years old, who once ruled the most extravagant court in Europe. She climbs the scaffold, steady,